Children of the Stones by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray. Chapter 14. Adam turned away from the window, strode across the room, and wrenched the door open. "Come on." Matthew shook his head, the hopelessness of their situation chillingly clear. "It's no good, Dad." "What?" "We'd never get out. We have to try. Waste of time." Adam frowned. "Matt, what's the matter with you? You're behaving as though you've been brainwashed already." "I'm just facing up to it, that's all. We tried to escape this morning. And what happened? We found ourselves back here. Di was right. We are trapped. Trapped by the stones. We can never leave the circle till what? Till we've been through whatever we have to go through." Adam sat beside him on the bed. "What do you mean?" "I don't think there's such a thing as a future in this place," said Matthew slowly. "It's all mixed up with the past. And the present. Yes, some sort of time trap. Another continuum. Something like that. The village has two levels. Two realities, one of which keeps repeating itself." Adam thought for a moment. "So, if we're right, everything happening now has happened before. It's all predestined." "Yes. I've had this strange feeling ever since we arrived. Margaret, Sandra, Mrs. Crabtree. Sometimes I really knew what they were going to say next." Outside, the chant was gradually increasing in volume. Adam crossed back to the window and looked out. More villagers had joined the circle, and they were looking up at the house in eager anticipation. He started to pace desperately around the room. "There must be something we can do." "I'm sure there is," said Matthew quietly. "The question is, what?" "Dunno. But there just has to be a way we can get back to the real world. There just has to be." "Why?" "Because of the painting. The man and the boy. Remember? They were the only ones who looked as if they were escaping." Adam stared at him. "And you reckon that's us?" "Yes." "So all we have to do is find out how they did it." "We have to find our own way. Use whatever it is that makes us special." "Our knowledge of astrophysics." "Maybe." "All right, what have we got to go on? The circle is aligned to Hendrix supernova, which is now a black hole." Matthew was suddenly sure that this was the key. "What do we know about black holes, Dad?" "Not much. They're super-dense collapsed stars whose huge gravitational forces allow nothing, not even light waves, to escape. Anything within their event horizons, their boundaries, is sucked into the center and crushed out of existence." "Imploding energy," said Matthew, digesting the information. "Suppose Hendrix managed to harness it. Suppose he is using it somehow to turn the villagers into happy dayers." "But why?" "Well, if he's some sort of priest, perhaps he thinks he's doing it for their own good." Adam smiled grimly. There have been enough men in this century who thought like that. I'm not talking about this century, Dad. I'm talking about something that happened thousands of years ago. In the beginning was the star. And the star was some sort of god. Ursa XB1. Adam whirled around excitedly. Bear worship. Hendricks said it was one of the oldest religions. Matthew jumped to his feet, the pieces of the jigsaw beginning to fit. Right. Originally, perhaps it had some sort of benign power, but then when the supernova became a black hole, the power was reversed. And the priests started using it to extract, well, something. Man's ability to think for himself, that quality, the quality that makes him human. They stared at each other, awed by the crevasse that was opening up in front of them. So that's what goes on in Hendricks' peculiar dining room, said Matthew. Whenever XB1 is in alignment with the circle, and being in the constellation of the Great Bear, that would recur frequently, daily probably. It still needs split-second timing to predict the transit, which explains the computer in the crypt of the church, and all these digital clocks. Adam inspected the clock on the mantelpiece. It needs something more accurate than this. Perhaps there's a master clock somewhere, feeding the signals all over the house. It's possible. Quartz? Or atomic, molecules focused by... Wait a minute. What? You said you saw machinery in the crypt. The vent was making your eyes water. Yes. Ammonia. Could that have been what you smelt? And if it was, the atomic clock is sometimes controlled by the ammonia molecule. Matthew let out his breath. So that's where he keeps it. Dad, if we could alter the... But Adam, way ahead of him, was shaking his head. Impossible. Why? Atomic clocks can't be altered. Nothing affects the ammonia molecule. That's why they keep super accurate time. Back to square one. Matthew gazed at the digital clock, searching for a way around the problem. All these digitals must be driven by a master signal, he said thoughtfully. Can't we interrupt it? Feed in some extra pulses? Yes. So they'll gain time, and so will we. Get Hendrick to process us before the black hole's in position up there. Let's find the junction box. They searched around the base of the walls. Here, said Adam. By the radiator. Matthew looked at the wire. It feeds down through the central heating system. Good. Now I'll need the oscilloscope. And the oscillator. Wonder what's happened to our luggage. Still in the car. Unless what? Hendrick's expecting us to stay. Perhaps he had it brought into the house. Well, there's only one way to find out. Adam crossed to the door and opened it. He listened for a moment, then peered out into the corridor. All clear, he whispered, and Matthew followed him out of the room. They tiptoed noiselessly to the head of the stairs and leaned over the banisters. Their luggage was piled up in the hall, just inside the front door. They started to creep down the stairs, but they hadn't gone more than 2 steps when Adam turned and put his finger to his lips. Matthew froze, listening. Voices were approaching from the direction of the kitchen. They raced back to take cover behind the balustrade, just as Hendrik and Link appeared below. They held their breath, conscious that the slightest creak would give them away. That picture. That picture, Hendrik was saying. The one I told you about. It must be here somewhere. Link opened Matthew's suitcase and started rummaging through the contents. I'm sure you're worrying unnecessarily, sir. How can an inanimate object harm you? I didn't say it could harm me, but I find it disturbing. It has a hidden meaning, which so far I have been unable to fathom. Link found the picture and held it up. This? Yes. And what is it that disturbs? Hendrik took the picture and propped it up on the mantelpiece next to the digital clock. The man and the boy. I don't understand why they're running? Escaping. You think it's a prophecy? I don't know. Link smiled. There's nothing to fear, sir. Your task is almost complete. What can go wrong now? Yes, you're right. Hendrik checked his watch with the clock. Everything ready in the kitchen? Perhaps you'd care to see for yourself. Set your mind at rest? Very well. The two men disappeared back into the recess of the house, and Matthew breathed a sigh of relief. Adam stood up, beckoned him to follow, and they ran down the stairs. This time, there were no interruptions, and they collected the two aluminum cases without mishap. Hope Hendrik doesn't notice they're missing, said Adam, after they'd reached the relative safety of their room. It's lucky he seems so preoccupied with the picture. Matthew watched while he detached the wires from the junction box and attached the terminals of the oscilloscope to it. In order to make their calculations, they had to measure the voltage, shape, and frequency of the signal. Okay, switch on? Matthew switched on the machine and studied the wave pattern on the dial. What's it look like? 200 volts at 55.2 hertz. And it's a square wave, so it can't be a main signal. No. Those digitals must be driven by the atomic clock. Adam glanced at his watch. Hendrik said dinner in 55 minutes. Did you notice from when? There's about a half hour left. Got a pencil? Matthew produced a pencil stub from his pocket. Now, I want an extra 5 minutes. Work out what frequency we need. He started to unpack the oscillator, while Matthew did some rapid calculations on the wall above the junction box. Dad, don't talk. This is one sum you've got to get right. But it's interesting. Early man worshipped the great bear, right? Right. Did you know that the Gaelic word for bear is math? I looked it up. Get it? Math. Got it, said Adam. The question is, have you? Matthew checked the figures carefully. We need a 64.1 hertz signal. That'll give us just over 5 minutes. Let's hope it's enough. Adam hit a switch, and the oscillator began to emit a low-pitched hum. And let's hope Hendrik's not clock-watching. The numbers on the digital clock began to flick past at an appreciably faster rate. Matthew watched them for a moment, then wandered over to the window. Outside, the circle was almost complete. 2 stragglers emerged from the shadowy undergrowth at the edge of the garden and took their places in the ring. The light from the house that spilled over the lawn illuminated the vacantly blissful expressions on their faces. Matthew stiffened as he recognized them. Dad. Look. Adam joined him and stared down grimly at the two figures below. They were Margaret and Sandra. So now they're happy ones, he murmured softly, waiting for the last of the minnows to be devoured. Matthew thought sadly of the first time he had seen Sandra, peering over his shoulder at the painting, and of his first meeting with Margaret, ministering to his father after he had touched the stone. He remembered the times they had all puzzled over the mystery together, and realized how close they'd been to solving it. Close, but not close enough. And now it was too late. Images that he had seen through Sandra's scarf flashed through his mind, and he could feel again the sudden, heart-stopping fear that had been transmitted from the dining room. He saw her figure being irradiated by the white, dazzling beam, and instinctively, he knew what had happened to her. Of course, he said, turning to Adam. It's the other way up. What is? Matthew tried to marshal his thoughts. The black hole. Gravity's so great that not even light particles can escape. So the dish under the village isn't a receiver. It's a transmitter. Transmitting what? Evil! Adam absorbed this idea in silence for a moment. Or Hendrik's idea of evil. The capacity to do wrong. Yeah. He uses the inverted gravitational force of XB1 to drain it away. The priest's sacrifice to his god. But hold on a minute. Where's the power source? Where does he get power for the transmission? The Lee lines. They bring the power, psychic power, into the circle. Adam stared at him. A pagan storehouse of energy. And to think I laughed at the idea. He spun around in alarm as footsteps echoed down the corridor. Quick, get that stuff out of sight. Frantically, they detached the wires from the junction box and stowed the equipment under their beds. They were just in time, for a moment later, Hendrik entered, smiling affably. Dinner is served. Will you follow me, please? Obediently, they followed him along the corridor and up the great staircase to the top floor. There, Link was waiting to usher them into the dining room. Hendrik stood aside and motioned Adam and Matthew to precede him. Matthew stared around the room. Although he had seen it before in his vision, he was amazed to discover how accurate his precognition had been. There was the round stone table, the high-backed throne, the sliding panel in the ceiling. It was hard to believe he had never set foot in it until now. Aren't you going to say, "What an extraordinary room," asked Hendrik. Most people do. Adam's face was expressionless. In what way extraordinary? Well, take my throne. An unusual piece, don't you think? Splendid. But it's exactly the sort of thing I should have expected a man with your conceit to have chosen. Matthew glanced at his father. He knew exactly what he was trying to do. Goad Hendrik. Take the offensive. Keep him off balance. It was the right strategy. You think I'm conceited? Hendrik sounded as if it were a matter of supreme indifference to him. I think you have an exaggerated sense of your own importance. I mean, you're so predictable. Even Matt can tell what your next move will be. Really? Hendrik surveyed Matthew coolly. Matthew felt it was time he did his party piece. You'll sit on your throne between Dad and me, he said, and explain that the table acts as a transmitter, focusing the psychic energy gathered by the stone dish underneath the citadel, the circle. Hendrik didn't look at all put out. Well, let's see if you're right, shall we? He motioned him to the table. Bon appetit, my children. They took their places on either side of the throne, and Link served them with some steaming hot broth. When he had finished, Matthew saw him raise his eyebrows questioningly at his master. Hendrik glanced at the digital clock, nodded, and Link discreetly withdrew. Matthew sipped his broth in silence, listening apprehensively as the sound of the chanting wafted up from below. Another village ceremony, asked Adam calmly. Don't you think you're overdoing them? There are many just now, said Hendrik, his eyes fastened on the clock. The summer solstice, you know. The time of ancient magic. Hendrik shrugged. The rituals are important. Tradition is very strong in this part of the country. Do you still practice human sacrifice? Crude and unnecessary. Our methods are much more civilized. Methods of what? Purging the community of sin. The task of priests. Indeed. It is our duty to accept the burden and take it on our own shoulders. Adam paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. But Hendrik was no longer listening. He suddenly bowed his head and began to speak in a low, rumbling voice that sounded like a distant avalanche. Anger of fire, fire of speech, breath of knowledge, render us free from harm, return to us the innocence that once we knew. Complete the circle. Make us at one with nature and the elements. Then, looking up, it is time. The strange procedure that Matthew had been able to see through Sandra's scarf began again. The panel in the ceiling rolled back to reveal a section of the night sky immediately above the table. At the same time, Hendrik's throne revolved, so that its high back formed a protective shield between him and his guests. The chanting of the villagers below was reaching a crescendo. Matthew looked at Adam in alarm, but his father put his finger to his lips and tapped his watch reassuringly. If he had done his homework properly, they had 5 minutes grace before Ursa XB1 was due to appear on the alignment path. The chanting suddenly stopped, and there was complete silence for what seemed like an eternity. Adam signaled to Matthew to remain calm, but it required a supreme effort of will to remain in his seat. Any moment now, XB1 would appear. At last, Hendrik's throne started to revolve again. Matthew quickly slumped across the table, and Adam followed suit. They heard the throne click back into position, and Hendrik's voice, soft and deep. "Arise, my children." Slowly, they raised their heads from the table. "I commune and identify with the forces of nature," continued Hendrik, looking up through the open panel at the night sky. "Your sin is my sin. Your guilt is my guilt. You are free. I have fulfilled my function." He turned to Matthew, who managed a beatific smile, despite the fact that he felt achingly vulnerable. He kept the smile in place while a dreadful thought occurred to him. Suppose he'd made a mistake in his calculations. "You are happy?" asked Hendrik very quietly. Matthew nodded. "Happy. Very happy. Very happy," repeated Adam. Hendrik smiled, and there was both triumph and relief in his face. "Happy day indeed. My flock is cleansed. My task is done." He pressed a button on the arm of his throne, and almost immediately, Link appeared. "Take them outside." Adam and Matthew stood up, grateful for the chance of moving out of XB1's range. "When you join the circle," said Hendrik as they joined Link at the door, "your initiation will be complete. You will be happy ones." As they followed Link out of the room, Matthew glanced back and saw that Hendrik had collapsed across the table. He looked drained and exhausted. Outside, the villagers were waiting for them, silent and motionless, their hands still joined in a circle. Margaret and Sandra broke the chain and held out their arms in a gesture of welcome. Matthew hesitated, but he felt Adam's hand in his back, propelling him on. With Link watching, they had no alternative but to complete the ceremonial process. But as soon as they joined the circle, Matthew sensed dismay and consternation among the villagers. Sandra stared at him, looking puzzled and disturbed, and let go of his hand. Then, one by one, the other villagers released their neighbors' hands and stood about, uncertainly. "We've broken the circuit," Adam whispered. "They're wondering where the power's gone." Matthew turned to find Link regarding them like a computer discarding possible alternatives. Then, seeming to select the right punch card, he turned and ran into the house. "He's on to us," said Adam, looking at his watch. "But I reckon he's just too late." Link rushed into the hall just as the grandfather clock started whirring in preparation for striking the quarter hour. He glanced at the digital clock on the mantelpiece and saw that it differed in time by nearly 5 minutes. He cursed softly. So his master had been right. These last two were a threat. But how had they done it? His eyes fell on the luggage by the door. Of course, the 2 missing cases. He should have been more careful, taken Hendrik's warnings more seriously. He ran up the great staircase to the dining room. Hendrik was still slumped across the table, but raised his head in alarm as Link burst in. "Master, they are still impure." "What?" "The circle is broken. Your protection is gone. You must leave immediately." Hendrik stood up, aghast as he realized the danger he was in. But it was too late. He was still in contact with the table as XB1's dazzling beam flashed through the open panel in the ceiling and irradiated his massive figure. The table cracked asunder, and he let out a wild howl of agony, pain, and despair. Link watched, transfixed with horror, as his silhouette dissolved into those of his priest predecessors. Medieval, Saxon, and finally, the robed shape of a Stone Age spiritual leader. Then, this too dissolved, leaving only the blinding brilliance in the center of the room. The primitive howl began to fade, echoing down the centuries until there was silence. The silence of eternity.